At the end of the Second World War, America was virtually untouched by the devastation that had ravaged all other major powers. France, Germany, China, and the Soviet Union had experienced full-scale invasions of their territories, while the UK and Japan faced intense bombing campaigns. The United States took an active role in the post-war world, helping Western Europe and Japan rebuild their economies and forming trade networks that helped boom the U.S. economy. By 1964, we see that the public's trust in government was at a high 77%, meaning just over 3/4 of people trusted the U.S. federal government. However, if you're aware of the current political environment in the United States, it may seem impossible for trust to have been that high at any point. As of May 2024, trust in the federal government sits at a mere 22%, meaning under a quarter of Americans do not trust their government to do what is right most of the time. All of this data is courtesy of the Pew Research Center, who ever since 1958 have collected polls of Americans, asking the question, do you trust the government to do what is right? If you analyze their chart, you'll quickly notice the fall in trust between the end of the 60s and the start of the 70s. This video will look at the multitude of factors that I believe caused the decline of public support from 77% to 36%, and why trust never fully rebounded after 1975. But first, let's give some context to the major players and events that defined the decade of lost trust. As the soldiers who defeated the Axis powers returned home, they wanted to start families, but needed homes and jobs to do so. To solve this issue, Congress passed the GI Bill in 1944 that provided higher education and job training to veterans coming home from war. This bill went a long way in providing financial stability to veterans, but to start families, these veterans needed homes as well. This demand was quickly capitalized on by real estate development companies like Levitt and Sons, who started building large housing developments outside of urban cities that would quickly be dubbed suburbs. These new suburbs were extremely uniform, often with every home being a cookie-cutter copy of all the others. For the generation that grew up through the Depression and had to fight in the war, this stability was a blessing. However, as would be seen in the decade of lost trust, the generation of kids that grew up in the suburbs, those who became known as baby boomers, felt smothered by the intense conformity of the suburbs and sought a more independent and vibrant lifestyle. The same year the war ended and veterans began coming home, the Indo-Chinese War began. Indochina had been occupied by France for decades, but during Japanese occupation of the territory, the locals had seen that the French were far from invincible. In the time between Japan abandoning Indochina and France restoring order in the colony, the communist Viet Minh seized their opportunity to fill the power vacuum in the area around Hanoi. When France came to restore order in the colony, they succeeded in reestablishing their power in the south of the country around what was then called Saigon, but failed at regaining control of the north around Hanoi. Seeing as France was broke as a result of German occupation, a deal was made with the Viet Minh where the north would become communist and the south would become democratic, under the supervision of Western nations, particularly the United States. This deal allowed for the communists to consolidate their rule around Hanoi and commence a communist insurgency in South Vietnam. This insurgency proved to be quite the threat to the unpopular South Vietnamese government, seen by many of its citizens as a continuation of Western domination. This insurgency would precipitate an increased U.S. presence in the coming years. As the baby boomers were being born and the Indochina War unfolded, we also saw the rise of Richard Nixon. Born working class in 1913, Nixon would work his way into law school before, like many men born into what we now call the Greatest Generation, pausing his life to serve in the Second World War. While Nixon was never a war hero like his eventual rival Kennedy, Nixon served valiantly in the Pacific Theater and returned home ambitious. He ran for and won California's 12th Congressional District in 1946, where he became a notable anti-communist crusader, working on the infamous Alger Hiss perjury trial. Nixon spun this notoriety into a successful bid for Senate in 1950, and 2 years later, a spot on the 1952 GOP presidential ticket alongside Dwight D. Eisenhower. Nixon would serve as vice president for 8 years, receiving one of the largest roles a VP has ever gotten. Launching his own bid for the presidency in 1960, he narrowly lost to Kennedy. Trying to rebound, he challenged incumbent Pat Brown for California governor, but went on to lose in a shocker. After this loss, Nixon famously said,
"You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference."
It appeared to most, and seemingly even Nixon himself, that his political career was over after his back-to-back defeats. However, Nixon seemingly reconsidered his future and waited on the next opportune moment to seize the spotlight. Typically, poorly justified wars on other continents are unpopular, and as they escalate, the more citizens become skeptical of the motives of the government and the military. By 1965, the memory of the Korean War was still fresh in the minds of all voting-age Americans. They all remembered the deployment of UN and American soldiers to fight a proxy war that accomplished 37,000 dead American troops and no grand victory. Despite this attitude, both the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations entangled the U.S. in a new Asian proxy war. The U.S. did not become fully involved in the war until August 1964, when the U.S. ship Mannix was attacked by the Vietnamese. Despite the damage being limited and reports being exaggerated, it did not prevent Cold Warriors within the government from pressing what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident to drum up American involvement, and by 1965, American forces were on the ground in combat roles. According to data from Pew Research Center, overall trust in the federal government was at 77% in 1964, while according to the American Presidency Project, Johnson had an approval rating of 74%. Over the next 2 years, America had made little progress in their vague goal of containing communism and saw 8,000 fatalities. Accordingly, by the end of 1966, approval numbers started to shift. A poll in December 1966 found that Johnson was only approved by 44% of the public, while trust in the government was down to 65% from the previously mentioned 77%. However unpopular the handling of the war was, many still believed that ground forces were necessary in Vietnam. In August 1965, a poll found that 24% of Americans believed it was a mistake to send troops to Vietnam. By January 1967, the opinion had only changed to 32% of Americans thinking it was a mistake. This continued faith in the deployment of troops suggests that while the attitude towards war was gradually souring the U.S., other factors like civil rights legislation and Johnson's new Great Society programs had been other large reasons for the dip in both Johnson's approval rating and overall trust in the federal government. However, it would only take one action by the Vietnamese to flip support for direct U.S. involvement on its head: the Tet Offensive. To understand why the Tet Offensive was such a big deal, we first need to understand the nature of the Vietnam War itself. The Vietnam War wasn't a war against North Vietnam. It was a guerrilla war where the U.S. fought North Vietnamese partisans known as the Viet Cong. The war had no front lines. It was in essence a game of whack-a-mole, where the U.S. located and tried to eliminate Viet Cong partisans in the jungles of South Vietnam. The U.S. couldn't go and invade the north of the country without triggering a Chinese retaliation similar to what happened in Korea in 1950. Because the U.S. was unwilling to seriously strike the base of the Viet Cong, the U.S. had no hope of ever truly defeating them. The U.S. government was not dumb to this. The Pentagon Papers, which we will discuss later, made it clear that the U.S. knew it couldn't win and was merely there to shield the feckless South Vietnamese regime. The U.S. did this due to its belief in domino theory, the idea that if one nation falls in a given region to communism, the rest of the nations around it will soon follow. All of this combined to create a conflict that the U.S. knew it couldn't win, yet felt it had to fight. In order to keep support for the war strong at home, the military and government worked together to create the illusion of a simple and limited containment war, an illusion that shattered after the Tet Offensive. Before the Tet Offensive, the war received limited and always positive coverage by the media, but the massive offensive was far too tempting for the media not to investigate further. The most famous of these being Walter Cronkite's Report from Vietnam. Coverage like this illuminated the true situation on the ground and gave the people an idea of just how manipulative the U.S. government had been about the war. Now many began to question why the U.S. had 500,000 soldiers in a conflict that was increasingly being seen as never-ending and pointless. leading to an explosion in the popularity of protest groups. This assessment is supported by the radical change in data, which showed that the offensive permanently changed Americans' view on the entire conflict. Only a month after the offensive, Gallup polling showed 46% of Americans now believed we made a mistake by sending troops compared to only 42% who thought it wasn't. By 1969, 52% of Americans believed that the deployment of troops to Vietnam was a mistake. Even though the offensive was a tactical failure for the Viet Cong, it forever shattered the morale of the American public, which would snowball into America's withdrawal 5 years later, and the ultimate victory of North Vietnam 2 years after America's withdrawal. The Tet Offensive also tanked Johnson's approval rating. A poll in early January 1968 found Johnson had a net approval of +9, but only 2 months later, in mid-March, a poll found that Johnson's net approval had fallen to -16. This collapse in approval and a poor showing in the New Hampshire primary led to Johnson bowing out of the 1968 election. Of course, the Tet Offensive did not lead to a U.S. withdrawal, and after Lyndon Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey failed to beat Richard Nixon in the 1968 election, it meant that a new administration was set to handle the Vietnam War. But before that, let's shift our focus to the protest movements that also played a key role in the degradation of public trust. Baby boomers are characterized by the explosion in birth rate once soldiers had returned home from the Second World War. When Vietnam troop deployments started in 1965, the oldest baby boomers were 20 years old, and by the time of the draft, 24. So boomers were the prime age demographic that had to go fight in the war in Vietnam. Boomers grew up in the post-war consensus, where as long as you were white and fit into a certain social standard, you were enjoying a never-before-seen amount of prosperity. Most of the baby boomers were born into suburbia, the series of new housing developments springing up across the country we described in the context section of the video. Even if suburbia was prosperous overall, it was also extremely bland and bred discontent within this massive new generation. Out of this discontent would breed what is now known as the counterculture movement. Often characterized by hippies, the counterculture movement was far more than that. The counterculture movement gave rise to many protest organizations which were based on anti-war sentiment, as well as issues like civil rights. Organizations like SNCC came to popularity for their role in the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. However, by 1966, Vietnam was becoming less and less popular, with SNCC and other organizations declaring that the U.S. had been deceiving the public about the war, with SNCC stating, "The murder of Samuel Young in Tuskegee, Alabama is no different than the murder of peasants in Vietnam." Even popular figures from the civil rights movement who inspired millions came out in support of the anti-Vietnam War protests, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his "A Time to Break the Silence" speech. This didn't come without consequences, as many liberal allies called out his criticism of Johnson, who had done so much for civil rights. However, King decided it was too serious an issue not to use his popularity to draw attention to it. By 1968, the anti-war protests had gotten very serious. Nothing other than dead Vietnamese and Americans had been accomplished in 4 years on the ground, and many college campus protests began, some of which resulted in dead students, only further galvanizing these protest groups. The most famous protest was outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago during the 1968 Democratic Convention. Many felt like the Democratic establishment had pushed out anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy in favor of the current Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who was in line with the Johnson administration in its handling of the conflict. When it was announced at the convention that Humphrey won the nomination over McCarthy, chaos erupted. By the end of that chaos at the convention, 668 had been arrested and 192 police officers had been injured, and Humphrey remained the nominee. Even after Nixon won and Johnson and Humphrey were out of office, the protests continued and blood kept spilling at many protests across the country. Nixon's campaign consisted of lots of anti-counterculture messaging and a promotion of law and order, calling himself the law and order president who would end the chaos. This campaign rally cry for Nixon highlights a concept known as the silent majority. Made up of those who fought in World War II, just like Nixon, the silent majority wanted to return to the post-war consensus of the 1950s and an end to the counterculture movement. However, ultimately Nixon's failure to end the war only bolstered the protest movement to new popularity and saw the protests only grow louder. At the same time, this also resulted in a large decrease in trust from the silent majority who wanted a return to normalcy. National Guardsmen were often sent to quell protests and to maintain order. However, sending in all of these troops would have its consequences. Incidents like the Kent State shooting in 1970 communicated to boomers that if they were to protest against their government, there would be consequences. Incidents like the Kent State shooting likely contributed to the decline in trust in government from 1968, when 62% of the public trusted the government, to only 54% by 1970. Communicating to the largest generation of people the country had ever seen that they should fear the government busting them for drugs, the National Guard shooting at them for merely protesting, or the draft making them go fight a war they had no stake in, increasingly accelerated boomers' distrust in the government. At the same time, the continued presence of protests into the 70s increasingly angered those in the silent majority who began to lose faith in the government to control its own citizens. Therefore, the emergence of protest movements convinced two different generations of Americans that the government was not working, which undeniably contributed to the decline outlined in this video. As discussed in the previous two chapters, the Vietnam War and its unpopularity were enough to catapult former political exile Richard Nixon to the presidency. Nixon had been in the shadows of the GOP, waiting for his chance to take back the White House for his party. Nixon had promised to get the troops home out on the campaign trail. However, in this goal, Richard Nixon had accomplished very little in the first years of his presidency. Despite being personally opposed to the draft, he still let the military implement the first draft of Americans since World War II, and sponsored harsh retribution for draft dodgers. Anti-war movements had only gotten stronger, and men kept dying in Vietnam, even if he was gradually decreasing the amount of men serving there. The deployment of U.S. troops in Vietnam had become even more unpopular throughout Nixon's first 2 years in office, with the troop deployment going from a disapproval of 52% at the start of his term to a disapproval of 60% 2 years into his term. Nixon's overall approval rating wasn't faring much better. After 2 years into the job, Nixon had around a 65% approval rating. However, 2 years later, in March of 1971, Nixon's approval rating had fallen to 50%. Part of this decline can be attributed to his failure in quickly ending the conflict in Vietnam as promised, with Nixon's actions of scaling up bombing in Vietnam and targeting neighboring Cambodia seemingly only escalating the war further. On top of this, the public became more and more annoyed at South Vietnam for its lack of will to defend itself, not to mention that the U.S. was still pouring endless money into what was increasingly becoming seen as not just a corrupt South Vietnamese regime, but a South Vietnam actively exploiting the goodwill of the United States. As the war became more and more unpopular, a bombshell report known as the Pentagon Papers was leaked and published in the New York Times. The papers contained confessions from the military that the war was an unwinnable quagmire from the start, and highlighted 3 decades of meddling in Southeast Asia by the United States even before the commitment of ground troops. Americans were outraged that the government would lie to them and tell them the war was a winnable conflict that was worth time and effort, as well as hiding information about the true extent of American involvement prior to committing ground troops. The leaking of the papers also caused a domino effect that would eventually lead to the Watergate break-in a year later. As the Nixon administration got more and more desperate to end the embarrassing conflict, they settled for what was a peace with honor. This peace saw the U.S. gain no substantial concessions by the North Vietnamese other than a ceasefire and a pinky promise by the North Vietnamese government not to invade South Vietnam, now almost completely defenseless. It was a deal that was a retreat in all but name. Only 2 years later, after a swift offensive by the North, the South Vietnamese government and military fell apart, leading to the capture of Saigon and formally uniting the North with the South and ending the Vietnam War. As an isolated incident, Vietnam was not impossible to recover from by the standpoint of trust lost. Trust had fallen from 77% to 53% from 1964 to 1972, but with stable and effective governance, that could have easily rebounded. However, the Vietnam War was not an isolated incident. As the war progressed, its strengthened protest movement spawned a change in more sensationalist media, and through Nixon's paranoia about the Pentagon Papers, created the environment that led to the Watergate scandal. While in a vacuum, the Vietnam War may not have led to a massive and permanent decline in trust, it served as the crack in the foundation that let other factors like Watergate lead to that massive and permanent decline. Watergate remains the most infamous political scandal in the history of the United States, and it caused an immediate and dramatic drop in trust in government. Somewhat ironically, the roots of the Watergate scandal stemmed directly from the conflict in Vietnam. Nixon had been irate that the Pentagon Papers had been leaked, and there had been zero punishment for the leakers. This prompted Nixon to form the White House Special Investigation Unit to try and find the leakers in the federal government. This group, nicknamed the Plumbers, would quickly turn into a fully operational organization engaged in covert operations against anyone Nixon considered an enemy of himself. A good example of how the Plumbers operated was their plot to ruin Pentagon Papers leaker Daniel Ellsberg by breaking into his psychiatrist's office and leaking his file to the press so that the public would dismiss him as crazy. Even though the plan made little sense and the risk of getting caught doing it far outweighed the benefit of ruining Ellsberg, they went ahead with the operation and failed to find Ellsberg's file. Even if they had, there wasn't even anything on the file that would have hurt Ellsberg that bad, seeing as Ellsberg was a normal guy. I hope that helped to illuminate how risky and downright idiotic the Plumbers' various plots were and how little reward they even had. The Plumbers then went ahead with their most ambitious plan, a break-in at the Watergate Hotel. Unfortunately for the Plumbers, security noticed the poorly done break-in and called the police, who raided the building, and 5 plumbers sneaking around the DNC offices were caught red-handed. The break-in was seemingly politically motivated, as they had wiretaps, cameras, and were poking around offices, setting up various spy implements. Shortly after this break-in, Bob Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, had a conversation with him about it on what would become known as the smoking gun tape. Nixon informs Haldeman that he needs to make sure that the FBI does not look into the affair any further. Once some of the plumbers started talking, investigators started making connections to the Nixon administration, and especially Nixon's re-election committee known as CREEP, who had been paying for the burglars' legal defense. As these investigations went on, Nixon realized everything he had said was on the tape. After tampering with the first tape, Nixon realized that there was incriminating evidence on every single recording, and thus decided the only way his presidency would survive would be by doubling down on the cover-up. Eventually, the Senate set up a committee to look into the events of Watergate, and Nixon's once loyal inner circle began to increasingly come out against him. Things got worse for Nixon when John Dean openly talked about covering up the break-in. It was soon revealed to investigators that Nixon had taped his conversations in the Oval Office, and Nixon was subpoenaed multiple times to give them up. It took a famous Supreme Court case called the U.S. v. Nixon, in which the court rejected Nixon's executive immunity and said he had to give the tapes over. Tapes like the June 23rd tape, now known as the smoking gun tape. That June 23rd tape showed that without a shadow of a doubt that Nixon knew about Watergate fairly early on and actively tried to cover up the break-in, and by extension his own involvement. If Watergate had occurred in isolation, its damages would have been somewhat limited. However, coming off of what many believe was America's biggest defeat in a war ever, it was a horrible look for the federal government. Out of any of the events discussed in this extended essay, we see the largest 2-year fall in public trust from 1972 to 1974. In 1972, Watergate had only been a minor story, assumed to be an overzealous Republicans. However, by 1974, Watergate had exploded into the largest political scandal in the history of the U.S. This reflected in the 17-point drop in trust from 53% to just 36% in 1974. As you would imagine, Nixon's approval rating suffered dramatically as well. In November 1972, coming off his 520-point Electoral College win, Nixon's approval rating was an impressive 62%. However, the last poll conducted before he left office showed Nixon had a putrid 24% approval rating. Even Republicans were outraged and disgusted by these actions, as they went against the sportsmanship culture of politics at the time, when doing even morally questionable things to win an election was frowned upon. So when it was revealed that Nixon had actively obstructed justice, it was decided that Congress would hold an impeachment trial for him. Instead, Nixon decided to step down and let his newly picked Vice President Gerald Ford take control of the country, one of his first actions being the pardoning of Nixon. Watergate remains in our understanding of the government in a way that Vietnam just never could. If Vietnam was the crack in the foundation of trust, Watergate was the collapse. It established that even the presidency could be corrupted by the personal ambition and abuse of power, and that there were many ways the executive branch could try and subvert the checks from other branches. The executive branch would now be examined with more scrutiny, inevitably leading to more discoveries of failings, which led to more scrutiny in a positive feedback loop that failed to ever let Americans rebuild trust in the presidency and thus the government. On August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon became the first and to this day only U.S. president to resign from the office. The pressure was too much. The tapes were out, the House was preparing impeachment proceedings, and it looked like the Senate would convict him. Instead of facing the music, Nixon bowed out and left the job to his recently appointed vice president, Gerald Ford. Ford himself remains the only president to have never been elected on a ticket, as he was appointed vice president after a kickback scandal forced Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, to resign. Many believe unfounded claims of a conspiracy between Nixon and Ford, where Nixon would resign and thereby give Ford the presidency in exchange for the pardon. In reality, Nixon had little leverage in that situation, seeing as he was likely going to be removed from office anyway. All evidence points to Ford deciding to pardon Nixon himself, Ford stating that,
"I have been advised, and I am compelled to conclude, that many months and perhaps more years will have to pass before Richard Nixon could obtain a fair trial by jury in any jurisdiction of the United States under governing decisions of the Supreme Court."
In addition, Ford would later justify the pardon by citing the 1915 Supreme Court case of Burdick v. United States, a case that implied that acceptance of a pardon was tantamount to confession of guilt for the crime. He did this to show that Nixon may not have been punished, but by taking the pardon, he had actually confessed to his crimes. I certainly understand where Gerald Ford was coming from. A very sensationalized trial would have undoubtedly eclipsed any other seen before. Think the O.J. Simpson trial on steroids. If you're not old enough to remember the O.J. trial, which I'm not, but from what I gather, second-handedly, the trial was still extremely decisive, even though he was absolutely guilty. Now, imagine that trial without a famous football player, but with a United States president. Keep in mind, he probably makes the same argument O.J. does, just instead of the police framing him, it's liberals and hippies. Gerald Ford knew this was the outcome if he didn't pardon Nixon, so the question is, what outcome would have led to less public trust in government? Obviously, I'm speculating on some of the details of a hypothetical Nixon case, but I still believe that it would have been extremely damaging for public trust in the short term. In our reality, the memory of Watergate faded but never really disappeared. Had Nixon been convicted and thrown in prison like he should have been, the memory of Watergate would have stayed present for years but eventually faded out completely. Instead, the pardon calmed the fire but never put it out. A little over a quarter of the current United States population still remembers Watergate happening, and many more were raised by those who remembered it and told their kids about it. While the pardon got Watergate out of the headlines, it kept it in the zeitgeist. In the broader American zeitgeist, Watergate turned from an example of how evil Nixon was to an example of how corrupt our government is. The general historical consensus about the pardon of Richard Nixon is that Ford made the right call. I disagree with this sentiment, seeing where we are now. While the pardon really didn't sink public trust deeper than Watergate did, public trust hovered in the mid-30s for the rest of Ford's term, showing it wasn't helpful in restoring trust as much as stopping the bleeding. The pardon was the last act in the decade of lost trust that damaged the public's trust in government. While it finally ended Watergate, I believe Nixon's lack of real consequences is one of many chief reasons the public trust never recovered to post-World War II levels. Over the course of the decade of lost trust, the public's trust in our government to do what's right at least most of the time fell from 77% of Americans to 36% of Americans. In the years after this collapse, 4 of the next 5 American presidents were all governors considered outsiders to Washington politics. However, these outsiders never restored public trust to above 50%, barring the post-9/11 hysteria. In fact, I believe the brand new precedent of a lack of punishment for presidential crime had a negative effect on the conduct of future presidents. 3 of those 4 outsider presidents, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, all had major scandals that managed to keep public trust in the government low, those being Iran-Contra, Monica Lewinsky, and the Iraq War, respectively. In all of these scandals, the president and his administration lied to Congress and to the public. They had all obstructed justice, doing so with the knowledge that when Nixon obstructed justice, he may have had to resign, but he never faced any more punishment than that. Worse still, the only one of these two-faced presidents to ever even get impeached over their lies was the lightest offender in Bill Clinton. The other 2 who were actively promoting war with their scandals never even sniffed impeachment. All of this lying from the executive branch only served to reinforce that politicians more broadly could do whatever they want, lie to whoever they want, and still get to be president. Even if it's due to partisanship, no matter who's in charge, the majority of Americans will never be able to look at a single president and trust them. All of this presidential shenanigans fails to mention how Congress has routinely failed to address issues like inflation, or the housing crisis, or any of the various drug panics of the last few decades. Instead, Congress seems to revel in arguing over pointless minutiae that only seems to promote their brands as political entertainers. Maybe that's why today public trust in government sits at a mere 22%. But understanding why public trust has gone from 77% to 22% in only 60 years requires more than just an analysis of recent or even 21st century politics. It requires an understanding of how that trust collapsed from 77% to 36% over the course of a single decade, and why actions taken then still affect our perception of the federal government to this day. Wow, thank you for making it to the end of the video. It means a lot that you're listening to me right now. This is the first video I've ever made. It's going to be like 30 minutes or something. I'll see how I cut it up, but yeah, man, I am very thankful if you're listening at this point that my ramblings have managed to keep you entertained or at least educate you. I'd like to add that this video was made without the assistance of artificial intelligence. It's a big one. If you made it this far, you clearly liked it, so if you hit that button, it'd help a young channel a lot. If you really liked it, maybe you could subscribe. I don't know. Ring the bell. I don't know. But yeah, that's it for me. I have a few ideas for videos kicking around. Don't know how that'll work out, but we'll see. I have a blue sky. If I get more followers on there, I might start posting. But for right now, I might just be a replier, so watch out for that. Yeah, that about does it. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.